Let's go back to the book of Judges. We're almost ready for chapter 7. We will get there tonight. But we're going to finish up the rest of chapter 6 first. The last time we met, we talked about how Gideon was called to be a judge. The Midianites, a group of people who were raiders, kind of like Vikings, had started coming into Israel. Well, because they forgot the covenant. God didn't abandon them. They felt like that. But really they abandoned him. And so he turned them over to the Midianites for 7 years. And they came like locusts. Every year they showed up around harvest time and took all the food. All the animals, all the food, everything. And so you can imagine how Israel got hungry. And you can imagine how devastating it was to the economy and all that. So they were in a bad spot and they needed to be set free. So they called out to God, and he called Gideon. That's what we learned about last week. He called Gideon, and the first part of his mission wasn't to defeat the Midianites, but it was instead to tear down the altar of Baal and divert the people's attention back to Yahweh. Well, once he did that, now he's ready to fight. And that's what we're going to read about tonight. Let's start Judges chapter 6, verse 33. Judges 6:33. All the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him, and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali also. So there's this new season, a new harvest, and the Midianites come to eat. And they collect all the food, or they want to. And they met at the valley of Jezreel. So before they actually go in and start, they all group up in the same place where Barak defeated Sisera. The same place where he, remember the 900 chariots. That's the same place that they decided to meet. And I guess they probably figured it was going to go the same way that it had all the years before. They were going to be able to just walk in and take whatever they wanted. But this time it was different because, as he says, the Spirit clothed Gideon. The New Living says the Spirit of the Lord took possession of him. And it's a figurative way to say that the Spirit was empowering him. The Spirit had something specific in mind. God had something specific in mind. You know how he did with Samson, how the Spirit would come upon him. And Samson was full of strength. He was able to do things that no one can do. Well, that's what God was doing here with Gideon. He was making him ready to fight and do the Lord's will. And being under the influence of the Holy Spirit, he says he sounded the trumpet. That maybe he literally did, but that doesn't necessarily mean that. He made a battle call. He said, "Everybody report to me. It's time to fight." He did that by sending all these messengers all over Israel, and they told everybody. I can see how they did it. They take off on their probably donkeys, and they get into a place and they say, "Let me tell you this story about this man named Gideon. He tore down Baal's altar." Whoa, that's serious. He desecrated something important. But we know that God has called him, and this revival has started, and this man is going to set us free. He's going to drive the Midianites away. So everybody gets excited about it. The word spreads, and people come from everywhere to fight, to join him in the fight. And I can imagine being Gideon, watching, looking at the horizon and watching, is anybody going to respond to this? And he was a man who was full of doubt, so I have no doubt thinking that he probably was a little concerned about it. And who knows how many days the messengers were gone. He's standing there, he's waiting. Well, they should have been back by now. Why aren't they back? Is anybody coming? Nobody's responded to this yet. But then watching as those men start reporting for battle. And how exciting. We'll find out it was 32,000 people responded. And I can just picture the excitement with Gideon, realizing when God met with me, you remember the man came to him and said, "I'm with you, you're going to win this battle, and so go out, and mighty man of valor," and all that. This is finally coming true. I'm so excited. I can't wait to see what God's going to do, how we're going to win these battles and all this. Then, verse 36, Judges chapter 6, verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you've said. So he knows God's will already. If this is true, behold, I'm laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there's dew on the fleece alone and it's dry on the ground, then I'll know that you'll save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from it to fill a bowl with water. Then he said, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please, let me test just once more with the fleece. Let it be dry on the fleece only, and all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and all on the ground there was dew. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod, and the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So Gideon shouldn't have needed this extra bit of assurance, but he did. He saw the angel of the Lord burn up that sacrifice, and he saw him disappear, but he still had some doubt. And so he came up with this plan, and he says, this is how I'm going to know that you and I are on the same page. I believe that was you, Yahweh, at the fire, and I believe this is what you said to me, as you have said. But I'm still just not absolutely positive. And it's easy for us to condemn him because we're sitting here safely from the Midianites, and we don't have to worry about them. But try to walk in his shoes before you pass a judgment that's too harsh. What he was about to do was something that couldn't be undone. What he was about to do was very serious. If he was wrong, if he got a mixed signal somewhere and he messed this up, he was going to die, and a whole lot of people around him would die and suffer. So the situation would go from awful to far worse. 32,000 men would just be gone. This army that he raised, even though Israel finally had a real army, it was still a defeated people. 32,000 is nothing compared to innumerable. They had innumerable soldiers, as much as there is sand on the seashore. They had, same with camels. So if he was wrong about this, he was going to mess things up. So he really needed to be sure. The other reaction, some people have the reaction of condemning Gideon, just automatically condemning him. And, he wasn't right in what he did, but should be careful. But the other reaction that people sometimes have when they hear this story is they see this fleece, this test, as a model for trying to figure out God's will. I know it sounds crazy, but it's something that actually happens. Maybe they don't use it literally, but they try to use it figuratively. They say, we're going to lay out a fleece in prayer before God. And, of course, practically that can mean anything because it's figurative. But, you think about some of the stuff you might have heard. Somebody wants a new job. And so he says, well, instead of, I'm just not going to go in. I'm just not going to go in today. I'm going to lay right here in the bed. And if I get fired, then I know that it's God's will. And if I don't get fired, well, then it's not God's will that I leave this place. I heard about a kid who he was jogging along on the beach. And he wanted to know if he ought to marry this girl. And he has a Walkman on. And he says, well, God, if you want me to marry her, then make the recording stop. Make the music just stop. Well, it didn't. It didn't stop. No surprise. And so he broke up with the girl and all this. But, if he really wanted to test it, if he really wanted to follow the model that's given here, he should have asked God to make it work without any batteries. That would have been a lot more miraculous, would it not? But like I said, people lay out a fleece in all kinds of ways. So it can mean just about anything, however they want to take it. They do it because they think they're going to learn God's will from it. The problem with this is that Gideon's fleece wasn't meant to be a model. That's not what we're supposed to see when we read this. First of all, Gideon already knew God's will. So to use it doesn't make sense. Why would you use it to get God's will when he already knew? He says, if this is true as you have already said, then let's do this. So it doesn't make any sense to say you're going to get God's will from that. The only reason that he did it was because he doubted what he already knew. He knew what to do. He knew what God wanted, but he doubted it. God's word wasn't enough. And Gideon was afraid that God would know that's what he thought. And so he was worried God would get angry. He says, look, please don't get angry with me. Don't let your anger burn against me for asking you this more than once. So he knew that it was something that wasn't ideal. He should have had more faith than that. So when we read this story, we should see it for what it is. It's when human frailty meets divine compassion. It's when a man who doesn't have much faith approaches God, and God humored him. He put up with Gideon's lack of faith. But it wasn't a model that was supposed to be followed. It's just the story of how things happen. As fascinating as Gideon was, like all the other judges and the kings and whoever else, the prophets, he wasn't Christ. As amazing as his story is, it's not the story of God's Son. He's not perfect. He's just a human. If we want to know, while we're talking about it, we should talk about it. If we want to know what God's will is, what options do we have, especially in the new covenant? How do we know what God's will is? We can't take a fleece and put it out in the yard and say, well, God, if you want me to do this, then we could try that. But it's not really how it works. It's not what we're supposed to do. I think we could rely on the fact that, number one, we have the Scriptures. And the Scriptures lay out, if not just straight up facts, they lay out principles for us, things that we can see. This is how God thinks. This is what God requires. We also have the Spirit, and the Spirit indwells us, and He teaches us and shows us and guides us. And then we've also got our consciences. And it sounds too simple, I know. But the only reason it sounds too simple is because the idea itself has been muddled. People say, well, I know how to get to the secret, mysterious will of God. Well, it's really not that secretive and it's not that mysterious. I mean, it's actually fairly straightforward. It's pretty simple. If you can do it and you want to do it and God doesn't say anything about it, do it. Well, that's not very helpful. The Bible doesn't tell me who to marry, right? And so that's, I'm always looking for who am I supposed to marry, or what job am I supposed to have, or what am I supposed to buy this house or this car or whatever. Well, here's the thing. If you want to do it and you can do it, and God's word doesn't give you any reason to not do it, then do it. You have the Spirit. You have a conscience. And so if your conscience is stricken, then don't do it. If the door is shut, don't get frustrated about it. That's what I think about Paul when he was on the road. Where was he going? Macedonia? Is that where he was saying, we tried to go and God just wouldn't let us. He doesn't tell us exactly what happened, but I can imagine that there was an obstacle, something natural. And he just, I can't get in. Well, let's go this way. Well, we can't get in this way either. And finally he comes to the conclusion, you know what? God's not letting us go. Let's go do something else. Well, that's the same principle. That's the same thing that we do. You want something and you can do something, try. And if it doesn't work out, don't get frustrated. Just say, hey, close the door. If it succeeds, well, thank God for it. It says also, I'm going to talk about this while we're here. It says that Gideon was clothed with the Spirit. And now think about that. What does that mean? He was clothed. And that's what the Hebrew word means, to be arrayed, to have the apparel. Do you realize that being clothed with the Spirit, it didn't cancel out his humanity or his personality? He was still the same, being controlled by the Spirit as he was before. It didn't change that. And for some reason, people think that I'm gonna use these terms here interchangeably: being clothed with the Spirit and being filled with the Spirit. Walk in the Spirit. Those are New Testament concepts, and they are biblical. But for some reason, people think that being filled with the Spirit or walking in the Spirit means you're going to be perfect. Or it means you're going to be super spiritual. That's when I'm really filled with the Spirit, when I am super spiritual. And we get these images in our head of these very serious people. And they've got perfect posture. And they talk in a monotone voice. And they show no emotion, and it's just monk-like. Is that what it means to be filled with the Spirit? Well, look at Gideon. Look at how his life, look at how his personality still shows, how his humanity still shows, even while he's clothed with the Spirit. Now, we receive the Spirit at salvation, and he never leaves us. That's not something you see with Samson. He's coming and going, but that's not true in the New Testament, in the New Covenant. We always have the Spirit, and to walk in the Spirit means to be controlled by him. To walk in the Spirit means that he is in charge of us, and it's kind of like it's compared in one passage, don't get drunk on a bunch of wine, but rather be filled with the Spirit. So the way that alcohol controls a person's mind, well, the Spirit does the same thing, but it doesn't take away our personality or our humanity. It doesn't take away who we are. We're still going to do things that we shouldn't do. We are still going to have the same sense of humor. We're going to have all of our emotions, from happiness and joy to rage, even jealousy and all those others. You're going to have all those things because the Spirit doesn't override your personality or humanity any more than he did it with Gideon. We're going to be just as tempted, and we're going to be weak, and we're going to be prone to wander. But the difference is, like Gideon, that we know how the battle will end. We know that God is on our side. We know that he's fighting for us, and so we're trusting in him to do that. And God is patiently prodding us along, bringing us along into conformity to the image of his Son. And being filled with the Spirit, we desire that. Our hearts long for him. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. That's what it means to be filled with the Spirit. We have the desire and the ability to do good, but we still have our humanity, so we're going to have failures and weaknesses, and we still have our personalities, so we're not going to be super spiritual and strange and all that. We're going to be just ourselves, but lovers of righteousness, seekers of God, seekers of truth. So the bottom line here, just looking for some application in Gideon's story, is that we can be confident, we can be absolutely sure that we are filled with the Spirit even when we don't feel like it, and even when we don't act like it. And that's a point that I think needs to be stressed, because sometimes, even in Baptist or Baptistic churches that aren't charismatic or Pentecostal, even there, people want to feel an emotion when they worship, and they equate that with being filled with the Spirit, that we really had God's presence today. How do you have more of God's presence today than you did on your worst day? How do you have more of the Spirit at one point than you do at any other point? If you are saved, God has poured out his Spirit into your heart. You don't get more and less. It's not the old covenant. That's the reason that the old covenant is so weak. It's the reason that it's unable to save, because it didn't come with the assurance of salvation through the sealing of the Spirit. We have that in the new covenant, and whether I feel it or not is irrelevant. I'd like to feel it. I like the passion of knowing God and loving him. I mean, just today while I was studying, it was just emotionally moved by some of the stuff that I read. But what about the Sunday, and what about the sermons? And there are lots of sermons where I don't feel anything. I don't want to preach. Well, am I as filled with the Spirit then? Yeah. Doesn't matter how I feel about it. Doesn't matter what I do or what I'm thinking. What matters is that God has made a promise, and he's keeping that promise to us. And it's not necessarily going to look the way that some people have said that it's going to look. Gideon, case in point. So, God endured Gideon's doubt. He humored him. Gideon, you want to ask? I'm going to give it to you. And we'll see in a minute, he's actually going to offer to give him a sign without Gideon ever asking for it. So once God did this, though, once God confirmed, we are on the same page. I do want you to go do this. But now Gideon's ready to go fight. He's very excited. But you know what God did? He messed up the plan. Big time. Look at verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Earlier I had you just try to imagine how Gideon must have felt watching all these men come to him. Imagine how he felt watching 2/3 of them, more than 2/3 of them walk away. Not walk away, hurry away. They were leaving because they were afraid. And don't be fooled into thinking that he took it well, because you get down to verse 10 and you'll see that he was afraid. He was terrified of what was going to happen. He was too afraid to go through with the fight. But here's the thing, any nation can build an army. You just got to get the right people lined up. Convince other people. You get your messengers to go out there, some charismatic folks, and they drum up a bunch of folks, and everybody comes and they fight because, well, Gideon stirred them up. But it was God's intention to show that they needed him. You need Yahweh. You don't need a Gideon, you need a Yahweh. And it was his intention to show that they needed only him. He didn't want them to be able to boast about what they'd accomplished. He said they're going to brag over me. What he means is they're going to say, look what Gideon has done for us. Look what we've done for ourselves. We finally came together. We got enough men and we got enough muscle, and we went and we drove the Midianites out ourselves. And God said, that's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to boast about what happens on this battlefield. You're not going to give the credit to Gideon. He wanted them to see the difference between Yahweh and Baal. Baal got them into this mess. Yahweh was going to get them out. And he was going to do it without their help. So, he sent most of Israel's real army. They've worked so hard and finally got themselves a real army. He says most of them can go home. And they do. As devastating as that must have been, God wasn't even close to finished. He was still going to pare that army down. Look at verse 4. He said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I'll test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, well, he shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself, so separate them from the rest. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. So you've got two different kinds. One scoops the water up in his hands and drinks it out of his hands. The other one puts his face down to the water and sucks it up right out of the river or whatever it was. And the Lord said to Gideon, verse 7, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. I like how it goes from, they got it down to 300, and there was the enemy right there in front of them. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with 300 people? I mean, we had something going. I had a great plan, but now it's kind of ruined. God used this strange but effective way of paring it down to reduce the army's size. Some people think that the braver men would have been the ones. Suggestion, if you were a brave man, you're going to put your face right down there by the water because you're not afraid. So if that's what God was doing, then he left Gideon with... They couldn't have been cowards because they were of the 10,000 who weren't afraid. But anyway, they didn't do it the same way. Or maybe it's also suggested that people who scooped the water out with their hands, they showed more control, more self-control, right? Because you'd have been real thirsty. So instead of just diving into the water and drinking it, these guys are being slower, or they're being more aware, they're alert, what's going on around them. The point is, the reason, you could talk about all the different reasons, well, why would God choose like dogs or whatever? The point is that God had this as a method for getting that number down to 300 people. An impossible number. But he said, with 300 men, I will save you. Who will save you? I will save you. I'm going to use these 300. And if Gideon had been afraid watching the 22,000 men walk away, he must have been downright terrified with what remains. I mean, he sent out messengers and built up a decent army. He was being smart about he was being strategic in his thinking. He was being charismatic. He had all these people coming and responding to him. He had everybody's spirits up. And I imagine they were all thinking, you know what, we could actually win this. This is our time. We're going to do it. And then he does what he has to know is the stupidest thing he can do. Why would you get rid of your army? You let them go home because they were afraid? That's not how armies work. You just sent them home because they drank water the wrong way? Now you're down to 300 people. This is not good thinking. And think about what the people were thinking. Can you imagine being one of those 300 people who were left? What did I do to deserve this? I mean, I'm going to die. We had a chance. When I signed up for this, we had a chance. Now we don't have a chance. Why am I being punished? And they didn't see God vanish. They didn't get to do a fleece test. I can imagine they had some real serious doubts about it. And they were probably ready to leave. They would have said, well, we should have left with the 22,000 who were too afraid to fight. And if all this goes real bad, we're going to find a way to pin this on Gideon. So you can imagine how much discord there was in their camp, or how much fear and doubt, and what is going to happen here? That's exactly where God wanted them. I mean, what they had was what God wanted them to have, but he didn't want them to be afraid. And so that's why he does what's next here. Look at verse 9. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand." Now, he goes straight from this into verse 10. But if you're too afraid, and I can just picture God watching his face while he's talking. Hey, Gideon, take your 300 men. It's time to go. Go fight them. And Gideon's like, what? How am I supposed to do this? And he's afraid. It's suicide. But if you are afraid to go down with just one other guy. Go down with Purah, your servant. And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, "Behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent." The tent. That's where the main place where the general is going to do his strategizing. And struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, "This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp." As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. God knew what was on Gideon's mind, and he remembered his frailties. Yeah, you're clothed with the Spirit, but you're still just a person. And so instead of rebuking him, instead of punishing him, he offered to give him a sign. Gideon, I know you like signs. I know that's going to comfort you. So let me give you this one. Sneak down with one of your men and see what I'm already doing. Go hear it with your own ears. See it with your own eyes and find out that the fear that you all are feeling is nothing compared to the feeling that they are feeling when they realize the trouble that they're in. Now, the soldiers were innumerable. So how hard would it have been for two guys to just slip up there? It looked like a couple of soldiers who belong there. So he slips up kind of close and he gets where he can hear them and he's listening. And these two men have a conversation that turns out to be a prophecy. This giant loaf of barley bread comes rolling down the hill. That sounds strange, doesn't it? But from what I understand, barley bread is like it's the cheapest food. Nobody wants to eat it. You only eat it because you're starving. Well, that's exactly where Israel was. This barley bread represents the people that they have been oppressing, the impoverished people of Israel. The cheap bread is Israel. And the soldier instantly recognized it as that. This thing that's not worth eating. It's the only bread that they could afford after all their grain was stolen. Poor and useless. Their pitiful army is going to be used to squash the Midianites flat. He said that's got to be what that means. And because God was telling him, he filled him in. This is what it means. And so the man said it and it was true. And when Gideon heard that, he heard his own name and he heard what God was going to do, he just worshiped on the spot. He was so overcome with emotion and the realization that God is going to be faithful to his word. And even though he took my army away and left me with these 300 people and I don't know what I'm going to do, God knows what he's going to do and he knows how to do it. And so he returned to the camp of Israel, verse 15, and said, "Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand." And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them and empty jars with torches inside the jars. That is, you got a torch. You don't want the enemy to see the light, so you cover it with this jar, right? Put your jar over it, hide the light. And he said to them, "Look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. It's about 10 o'clock at night. It's about the time everybody would be going to sleep. When they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hand the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." So with his confidence restored, he goes back to the men, the 300 men who are waiting with him, and he gives them these instructions. And as far as the battle plan goes, it's really not that strategic. It's not too bad, but I mean, it's what the best you can do probably with 300 against innumerable. And it was a lot better than facing them head on. And so he splits the group into these. I need 100 men over here, 100 men over here, and 100 men with me. And that way we can kind of surround this group. We're going to look like we're coming from every direction. Everyone carried a trumpet in one hand and a jar with a torch inside of it in the other hand. And they waited just until everybody was asleep and the watch was changing, and then they all blew their trumpets at the same time. They all pulled the torches out and smashed the jar down at the same time. And they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," which, if you think about it, is kind of a funny thing to scream because nobody actually has a sword in his hand. You got a trumpet in one hand and a torch in the other. You're really not ready. But that's exactly what they were supposed to be doing. They didn't need swords because the Midianites heard the sounds They saw the lights. Put yourself in that place. You're just resting. You think everything's going to go like it has for the past 7 years. And all of a sudden, there's a bunch of trumpets from every direction. And there are lights coming on everywhere. And there's this crashing sound. And people are shouting. There's a battle. They are right here. And so they all got terrified. They panicked. Verse 21. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah toward Zererah, as far as the border. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and Asher and Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Gideon sent messengers all throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters and also the Jordan. And they captured the 2 princes of Midian. Their names were Oreb and Zeb. And they killed them, Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of the 2 men to Gideon across the Jordan. So here's the thing. The Israelites didn't need their swords because God was the one fighting for them. He sent the Midianites into a panic. They were so confused that they thought the Israelites were already in the camp. And they were so panicked that they started fighting each other. Just anything that moves, stick it. And that's what they did. They started fighting immediately. It's an interesting thing. When it was bad when Ehud made the Moabites look naive. You remember that story? They were all standing around waiting for their master. Well, maybe he's using the bathroom, so they're sitting there waiting. Well, Ehud made them look naive. Shamgar made his enemies, the Philistines, look incompetent because they couldn't kill one man who didn't even have a real weapon. He had an ox goad. And all these people are trying to come at him and they can't do anything to him. Well, they looked incompetent. But here, an innumerable army turned on itself. They literally routed themselves. How terrible is that? They had to flee, and the Israelites killed them all along the road, as far as they could go. It was a total victory for Israel, and God got all of the credit for it. He let the Midianites gather this innumerable army just so he could destroy it. He let the Israelites build up a pretty decent army just so he could reject it. He put the trumpets and torches in their hands so that they couldn't use their swords. Their strength wasn't in their number. Doesn't matter. 32,000, God doesn't need that. 10,000, no, I don't need that. Their strength wasn't in their number. It wasn't in their ability to fight. The Midianites were defeated because they were no match for God. That's why the battle was won. That's why God was never worried. That's why Gideon should have never been worried. And if you'll think about it, this is the same way that salvation works today under the new covenant. And when I talk about salvation, I mean it in a very broad sense. Eternal salvation. That's the way this works. What about other kinds of, maybe we shouldn't call it salvation, but other kinds of places where we need to be delivered? Maybe crippling fear. Maybe doubt, or just anything that controls a person. Anything that hampers our relationship with God. Anything that's difficult. The scriptures say to be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We are more than conquerors. The way our relationship is described in the New Testament, the relationship that we have with God, is that we are his children, but we are also his servants, and he's our master, he's our savior, he's our king, he is the Lord of all lords, he is the King of all kings, and everything he does for us is total. He saves us totally. And we're kind of like Gideon. We don't necessarily see the salvation beforehand. We're going to have the same struggles, same kind of doubts, same fears. But God is patient with us in showing that His salvation is total. And the wonderful thing about it is that He gets all the glory for it every time. It's always His doing. And when we recognize that, just like Gideon, we can't help but worship, can we? To praise Him. That's what worship is just praise. I don't think he had time right there in that spot to offer a sacrifice and go through a bunch of ritual. I think he closed his eyes and maybe just cried for a second. Just, God, I can't believe this. I'm so overwhelmed with what you're doing right now. And that was worship. He was moved to give God glory and praise. Our salvation is the same way. We give Him glory because of His salvation. I want to close with Psalm chapter 3, the third Psalm. And it's just 8 verses. You don't have to turn there. O Lord, how many are my foes? And while I read this, I want you to think about several things. I want you to think about Gideon. I want you to think about Christ and what He did for us. And I want you to think about yourself and how you could also sing along with this psalm. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and He answered me from His holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Father, this is our prayer to you tonight. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. You are worthy of worship. Answer us from your holy hill and sustain us. And we give you the credit. In Jesus' name, amen.